Grant then retired to a tree so he could not hear the shrieks of the wounded men in his former headquarters. Smoking a cigar while holding a lantern, he chatted with Sherman about the day's fight. Sherman said, "Well, Grant, we have the devil's own day, haven't we?" And he said, "Yes," said Grant, after taking a cigar. "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." April 7th would prove Grant's word prophetic. Despite the intensity of bloody fight of the second day, just as the day before, Grant, along with Buell's army, would repulse the Confederates on the field at Shiloh and ensure decisive victory for the Union. He would also lead 2 regiments on the charge himself during the second day's fighting. But obviously, Grant would describe the aftermath of this battle. "I saw an open field in our possession on the second day, over which the Confederates had made repeated charges the day before, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. The casualties in this battle were appalling. Grant suffered 13,573 casualties, while the Confederates suffered around 10,699 plus casualties. But since Grant could replace his losses, Grant's casualty rate at Shiloh was probably around 15 to 16%. Since the Confederates could not replace their losses, they only had about 25,000 men at the end of the first day of the battle, and they probably were reduced to around 17,000. The Confederates' casualties at Shiloh were around 22 to 24%. Grant realized, though, the cost of Shiloh and how it affected his strategy to win the war. Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon. I gave up all the idea of saving the Union, except by complete conquest. He would have to have used a new strategy to not conquer not just Corinth, but Vicksburg along the Mississippi River, which was considered the Confederacy's Gibraltar. 2 days after Shiloh, Halleck came down to Pittsburgh Landing to relieve Grant of command of the Western forces, but he still got to command the Army of the Tennessee. The reason why was because of rumors of Grant being drunk at Donelson and Shiloh, mainly started by Henry Halleck because due of jealousy to Grant's successes. Grant had a history in the Army that made him infamous, as well as to future lost cause historians in the future, but there is zero evidence that Grant was drunk at these battles. After combining Buell, Grant, as well as a new commander in William Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, Halleck took these 3 armies and marched into northern Mississippi. Corinth, with its major rail network, was the next target in his strategy in the Western Theater, but Halleck was cautious because of Shiloh, digging entrenchments instead of advancing, moving slowly, concerned about the enemy outnumbering him, stymie the efforts to quickly take Corinth. And Grant would notice this and offer suggestions, but Halleck would pretty much ignore him. But Grant knew that the only way to take Corinth was by speed and maneuver. The Confederates at Corinth fooled Halleck into believing that they were receiving reinforcements by rail with train whistles blowing. Grant knew it was a ruse, but Halleck fell for it and did not take Corinth quickly. The 3 Union armies marched into Corinth unopposed. The Confederate army disappeared. Because of this, Halleck believed Corinth was a great victory. Grant knew it wasn't. A Confederate army got away, and the war would be prolonged because of that. Months later, after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln, Grant understood that early in the war that if it came down to ending slavery in order to win it, he was all for it. Grant earlier in the war would say that if it came down to preserving the Union while ending slavery, he would follow his duty and obey the President's order. A unique general among others who still believed in preserving the Union while leaving slavery alone in the South. After the bloody Union victories at Iuka and Corinth, Grant understood that battles were not only an option of defeating the Confederacy and gaining Vicksburg and cutting the Confederacy in half. Slavery was crucial to Mississippi's economy, and they would not give it up due to its economic and social implications of white thinking and making sure that the white Mississippian was above the poor slave. This also included poor white Confederate soldiers as well. Once Grant and the Army of the Tennessee reached Corinth, the issue of slavery became very clear once soldiers started seeing the condition that slaves were living under in Mississippi. As a result of the Army's movements, slaves from local plantations, and sometimes in the entire state, flocked to the Union armies for liberation. On August 11th, issued new orders to bring his practice into conformity with federal guidelines. He laid down strict instructions that no runaway slaves should be returned to masters, and they should be employed as teamsters, cooks, hospital attendants, and nurses. For all that, Grant carefully warned his men not to move slaves from their masters, but only accept them if they showed up of their own volition. However, while they were in northern Mississippi, the foraging and new implementation of taking slaves and letting slaves come to Union lines would be used in the battles and campaigns ahead. While fighting occurred at Iuka and Corinth, Grant's army and other armies under the command of William Rosecrans would forage the countryside and encourage slaves to come to their lines, or let slaves come to the lines themselves. Nevertheless, the Confederates who witnessed this new strategy decided that their fierce resistance would have to come to a whole new level. Corinth would be secured. However, due to its high casualties, Grant and his army needed to change the war's tide for the Union effectively. It would have to be through conquest. That opportunity for conquest became another objective for Grant and his army. Once the campaigns and battles of Corinth ended, Grant now focused on Vicksburg, Mississippi's ultimate prize. Before the war, Vicksburg was a major river trading post for cotton being shifted to north and south for its economic livelihood, despite it being built on the backs of slave labor. Vicksburg was considered, as I mentioned before, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, mostly due to its hillside fortifications facing directly on the Mississippi River. Previous naval attempts in the city in the early spring and summer sought to destroy these shore fortifications, but were driven back due to Confederate resistance by both the shoreline forts and by Confederate naval operations on the river. Grant understood naval and army coordination was as important in order to conquer that river. In late November, December of 1862, Grant and the Army of Tennessee would begin their campaigns from Memphis and march to attack and take Vicksburg from the northeastern part of Mississippi, feeling that the northern parts of Vicksburg defenses were the weakest. Marching these, however, through heavy rain and dense mud slowed his progress. Grant attacked Sherman's 15th Corps to take steamer transports down the Mississippi River to find a landing point where the Army and city's commander, John C. Pemberton, would least expecting it. On the way, Grant's soldiers would forage for food, destroy railroads, burn cotton mills, and smash cotton gins, as well as gathering runaway slaves, would be a key asset to his campaign. Grant would then capture Holly Springs, Mississippi, set up as his main supply base. Sherman, with his corps, flowed down the Mississippi, unfortunately ran into problems. Confederate guerrillas would ambush the transports, and as a result would go into river towns to find them, and as a result sometimes burning those towns. This would delay precious time as Sherman was trying to land further downriver. Nevertheless, as Grant continued his campaign deeper into Mississippi, they ran into a problem. The supply base at Holly Springs was specifically targeted by Confederate cavalry under the command of Earl Van Dorn, a general who commanded the Confederate forces previously at Corinth. On December 20th, Van Dorn led a raiding force of cavalry striking Grant's advanced supply depot at Holly Springs. Commanding the post was Colonel Robert C. Murphy. Despite warnings to be on the alert for Van Dorn, Murphy took little precaution and then surrendered with so little effort at resistance. Van Dorn burned the vast stocks of supplies and ammunition there, and with that and the breaking of the rail line by Van Dorn, Grant's supply situation, already difficult, became impossible. As a result, Grant ordered his portion of the army, and James McPherson, another man who was rising in the Union Army in the Western Theater at that point, and his 17th Corps back to the land. They marched back to Memphis. But on Christmas Day and the following day, Sherman unfortunately didn't get these orders, and troops were dropped off at the Yazoo River's mouth in the Mississippi Delta. New soldiers, especially, were transfixed by the new environment that they were marching and fighting in. But the ground would be perilous because the terrain of the Delta was a nightmare in which to conduct military operations. Water courses worked like twisting serpents across the flat alluvial ground, and every few years or another of them seemed to tire this tortuous bed and forsake it for another equally serpentine. The abandoned riverbeds became sloughs, bayous, backwaters, and when silt deposits severed them from the mainstream oxbow lakes. This dangerous ground that Sherman's soldiers would march on would impede their progress, but were determined to pierce the northern defenses of Vicksburg as a result. Sherman and his 15th Corps would reach a place called Chickasaw Bayou, allowing very few accessible areas, an area that held a very stubborn Confederate line with well-in-place firing areas for defense. And on December 28th, Sherman ordered one of his divisions to attack the lines and attempt to take them through these two routes. All day, soldiers from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa assaulted the Confederate lines and repeated assaults through the dense woods along the line. Soldiers would use logs as cover to shoot at the Confederates in their defenses, and intense fighting resulted throughout the day. The Confederates would hold, but Sherman still did not give up and resolved to continue the fighting through his engineers to build a bridge that had another access point to the Confederate lines. He made the decision to attack on December 29th, but however, the engineers' breaches were not ready. The same intense fighting that happened on the 28th would occur the same way as regiments stormed the heights, both gaining and losing ground at the same time. Men attempting to cross by boat were stopped by Confederate rifle and artillery fire. The advance through bayous had transferred in mud and felt like quicksand. Fierce fighting from line to line made the fighting a slaughterhouse. After this fighting, they started to fall back across the entire Union line. Regiments sustained heavy casualties, and as a result, they called off the assaults. Sherman had 1,780 casualties, while the entrenched Confederates lost a near 190. He knew that the line he assaulted at Chickasaw Bay was too strong. Therefore, with the coordination of the River Navy under Admiral David Porter for naval support, he attacked a defended line at Haynes Bluff further downriver. But with weather conditions growing impossible, he canceled the proposed offensive. But his soldiers were relieved once they heard the news. On January 1st, 1863, after burying the dead and gathering the wounded, Sherman ordered a retreat from the bayou. But here, in this difficulty in Grant's part in his career as a general, this is what the North and South didn't know about him. Grant has perseverance. And he faced up to the mistakes he made and attempted to try again. Remember, perseverance. He did not give up easily. He learned his lessons from the first campaign and would institute new strategies for the upcoming campaign against the city. And Grant would later write in his memoirs about the foraging that happened while he retreated up north, and would use it later in the Vicksburg campaign. Once late January went to February, early March, Grant ordered a new campaign to start immediately. He used different routes through this campaign, building canals, going up both rivers, through swamps, thick bayous, and mud-like ground. But the camps of the army started falling apart through these bayous. Once the army was encamped, disease started running rampant throughout the camps of the bayous. Soldiers suffered from malaria, dysentery, smallpox, and especially the #1 killer of the Civil War, diarrhea. Each day, soldiers died from disease rather than the harassing fire of Confederate guerrillas on Union gunboats and transports. Each day, soldiers would write into their diaries and journals and other writings about comrades, daily funerals that died from diseases, and 21-gun salutes going off every single day. They would be buried in the Delta or somewhere near the Mississippi River, and I guarantee you that if you were to send an archaeological team into the Mississippi Delta near the Mississippi River, you would find soldiers' remains, because most of them would be identified as unknown. Conditions in the camp were very cramped. They had no proper area for latrines. Porter's gunboats, soldiers marching, could not get through the difficult terrain of the bayous and guerrillas fighting on them and stopping their offensives. Grant, along with his Corps and Division commanders, started building a canal to flow out the river into the swamp and bayous so that the Navy and its troop transports could flow and then land near the forts at Vicksburg. This canal was built by soldiers who were also assisted by runaway slaves taking Union lines. Most of these slaves would be used in building the canal, and sometimes, in essence, sometimes abused by Union officers and soldiers. Because remember, not every Union soldier signed up to end slavery, mostly to preserve the Union. And there was a lot of racism in the ranks toward these former slaves sometimes. Not all soldiers, just some of them. Nevertheless, the canal failed. And the first attempt at getting to Vicksburg through a different route failed. Other little mini Army-Navy campaigns in the bayous would be conducted, but would also fail. Sometimes, though, before all this, all you could do was see the hills of Vicksburg, possibly seeing the many parties and balls that night in the town, celebrating that Vicksburg had not fallen, and with overconfidence in their hearts that Vicksburg could not be taken. Once April of 1863 appeared, Grant presented a new strategy to his generals as well as Admiral David Porter. In dispatch to David Porter, April 1st, Grant wrote to Porter concerning an offensive against Haynes Bluff. Our scout had determined that I am satisfied that an attack upon Haynes Bluff would be attended with immense sacrifice of life, if not with defeat. Remember, Sherman must have told him about the fighting at Chickasaw Bayou, and it resulted in saying we cannot attack their defenses immediately. He proposed a new strategy to the Navy in order that Grant's army gets across the Mississippi instead of attacking directly at Vicksburg from the river and its forts. To find a way around Vicksburg, specifically either below or behind it. Grant would say, having them fully determined upon operating from New Carthage, either by way of Grand Gulf or Warrenton, I am of the same opinion as when I addressed you a few days since, that it is important to prevent the enemy from further fortifying either of those places. What Grant said next probably shocked Porter as he intention of writing, I would, Admiral, therefore renew my request to prepare for running the blockade as early as the day as possible. And that blockade would be the forts and defenses of Vicksburg. And then Grant then proposed that while the Navy ran past Vicksburg, that the Army would march down the Mississippi behind the Navy on a new proposed route that would get them below Vicksburg at a certain point where the Army could enter transports and then unload on the Mississippi side of the river. Grant also wrote to Henry Halleck of this plan. There are systems of bayous running from Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, and also from near the river at this point. They are navigable for barges and small steamers passing around by Richmond and New Carthage. There is also a good wagon road from Milliken's Bend to New Carthage. My expectation is for a portion of the naval fleet to run the batteries at Vicksburg once the Army moves through by this new route. Grant would then later confer with his generals on the overall plan of the strategy involved. He heard them out. Some of them aired their opinions, but they concluded that the plan would have overall importance of taking Vicksburg. They would agree, and the plan was sent once the Navy started floating past the defenses at Vicksburg. The new campaign started on April 16th, where Porter had a couple of troop transports that were empty, by the way, and that's intentional, and other gunboats to run the Vicksburg defenses. On April 16th, heavy cannon fire lit up the night, and intense firing between the defenses and the forts and the bluffs went up all night. After about a night of firing, the ships managed to slip past the Vicksburg defenses and as a whole. An hour or so later, the gunboats found a temporary landing spot 12 miles above New Carthage. Grant's ordering of the passage of Vicksburg defenses worked. But how would the Army fare of the Navy could float past the defenses to find a landing spot so the troops could embark on the Mississippi side? They still had to find that. Grant ordered his army to march on the Louisiana side of the river. This was done before the vessels went past Vicksburg defenses. The marching started on March 31st using Milliken's Bend as its main supply depot for the campaign, and they would march through Louisiana, coming into contact with Southern civilians along the way. Some of the houses on this side were burned for military reasons and taking the slaves away from their masters from the turning point. However, Union regiments such as the 31st Illinois, which was also part of Grant's army, that fought at Fort Donelson had different reasons for conducting a campaign in this new one regarding slavery. The men of the 31st held a rally a couple days earlier regarding their stance on the issue of slavery and arming former slaves to fight the Confederates. Their brigade commander, Lorenzo Thomas, told them of the importance of destroying slavery to conquer Vicksburg. According to historian Donald Miller, it was the most electrifying of rallies, speaking largely to soldiers from southern Illinois, a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiment. Soldiers from Logan's old regiment, the 31st Illinois Infantry, hissed and booed. Some of their mates had deserted after the enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation, and Copperhead's sentiment ran strong. John Logan, who was the former commander and the creator of the 31st Illinois, came to speak. He said he had been educated to love slavery and also supported it, and to believe that whatever opposed it was wrong. But this war opened his eyes. He changed. Slavery had struck at the life of the Republic, and there remained no alternative but to strike slavery. But by the help of God, he would never see his sword till the rebellion was crushed out. In order to do that, he said, we must hurt the rebels in every way possible. Shoot them with shot and shell balls and cold steel. And that also included using African Americans as soldiers. The regiment then burst into cheers and vowed to fight the Confederacy by destroying the institution. They only agreed, though, to defeat slavery so that they could end the war and go home to their families in Illinois, which makes a very complex attitude when you think about it, in character of Union soldiers in Grant's army. The 31st Illinois, in their regimental history on the march through Louisiana, said the weather was intensely hot, the roads covered with dry sand, many fell by the wayside overcome with heat. They would skirmish the Confederate forces. However, Grant and his army would reach a place called Hard Times, which overlooked the river's Mississippi side. Once the army heard that Porter's vessels ran past Vicksburg, cheers erupted along the shoreline. All the frustrations of the past campaigns against the city went into memory. However, now the issue was where to cross a certain point below Vicksburg so that Grant could catch Pemberton and Confederate forces by surprise. When Grant rode out to scout and assess the situation, Grant rode out, convinced him he had a problem that could propel the entire campaign. The additional roads had to be found. Marching an entire army down a single, miserably maintained dirt road could take months. And he also needed a larger staging area for his fast-gathering strike force, and one closer to Grand Gulf, Mississippi, his objective. Grant would then ask for Porter for additional transport to be sent down past Vicksburg so that his troops could be transported. So in order to do this, he also ordered Sherman and his 15th Corps to march north of the city and cause a demonstration against it in order to distract Pemberton's attention from the main movement of troops. Porter's gunboats also passed Grand Gulf with other transports and ships to spray the troops on the other side. Grant could not land at any possible location he wanted to, but only if it got below Vicksburg. Once Grant heard of this, he wrote to Halleck. The gunboats engaged Grand Gulf batteries until 1 p.m. and from dusk until 10 p.m. The army and transports are now below Grand Gulf. A landing will be effected by the east bank of the river tomorrow. I feel that the battle is now more than half won. Once they were crossing Grand Gulf, Grant received news that eventually made him decide to cross the river. Once receiving the transports, many scouting troops of Grant's army went throughout the countryside wanting to find someone who had valuable information for crossing the river at a specific point. As a result, 8 soldiers crossed the Yaw and ran into a black man who seemed to know every town and terrain feature on the riverfront. The best place to land, he told Grant, was Bruinsburg, 5 miles downstream. The nearly deserted plantation settlement had solid embankment for steamboats. A road led there to Port